It's time for the Soteriology 101 podcast, where God is most glorified by his love and provision for all people. Welcome your host, the Director of Apologetics for Texas Baptists, an adjunct professor of theology, and a local teaching pastor, Dr. Leighton Flowers.
Welcome to Soteriology 101. As you can see on the screen, Dr. Johnathan Pritchett is back with us. Welcome, Jonathan.
Glad to be here again.
Well,
always good to talk.
And you've got the squeaky chair back with you, and you got the room that's going to go dark on you here in about 10 minutes after we start talking. So,
absolutely.
All right, that's great. That's how we know Dr. Pritchett's on with us. That's right. Hey, I wanted to. We talked about this off camera and off screen before, and I wanted to get it on screen and on camera for our listeners because I think it's valuable information. Where I know this has really been one of your primary areas of study. It was a part of what helped kind of bring me out of Calvinism, along with the concepts of judicial hardening, messianic secret that we've talked about 1,001 times on the podcast. It's also this idea of the Jewish culture, of understanding how the Jewish person reading Paul or Peter or any of the apostles would have taken certain texts. And an understanding that there's a tribal or maybe even a collectivist type of mentality within the first century that's different from the way a normal Westerner would think of things.
Yes, but I wouldn't limit it to just the Jews. I would say all of the ancient Mediterranean, the Greco-Roman world was collectivist.
Okay.
So I wouldn't just limit it to how Jewish people would understand it. That's just the social dynamics, the way the culture was. In fact, most cultures in the world, not in the West, obviously, are collectivist.
Right.
And so even in the modern world. So, individualism is primarily a Western and uniquely Western Europe and American way of viewing the self as kind of this cognitive universe in and of itself as the singular individual person, right. Whereas most cultures, ancient and modern, are more collectivist and more group oriented. So
I think the most common example of this is like the passage out of Thessalonians where he says, "I thank God that He's chosen you." And it goes on to, quote, and there's several of them like that out of the church, his letter to the Thessalonican church, where he's talking to a primarily Gentile audience who is being told they're not chosen of God, they're not the elect of God. And for him to say to a primarily a Gentile audience, to say to them, "I thank God that He's chosen you." A Westerner hears, "Oh, I thank God He's chosen you, the individual, you, but not you over there." Whereas whereas the collectivist mindset would have heard Jew, Gentile contrast, our gospel being brought to you, the Gentile people. We thank God that He has selected you, that He has chosen you. This is a plan from the very beginning to bless all the nations of the world.
Well, and that text, I mean, is the you would be the Church of Thessalonica as a whole, as believers in Christ. And from the beginning, there's different ways to understand that phrase. I think the most likely understanding is from early on in Paul's ministry to the Gentiles. So I know some people want to stretch from the beginning to be before the beginning in eternity past or something like that. That doesn't work for that text, and certainly not talking about individuals. So,
right. Well,
there's people see texts like that, and they I don't mean to sound vulgar when I do this, but I always remind people that the Bible is not a theological toilet. That if you see certain words, you can just dump your theology into the Bible, because it's not a commode where you dump ideas into it. It's God's word from which you derive your theology from it on its own terms.
Right. There's a quote from, and I don't know if you can't see it, I don't think, Dr. Pritchett, but I'm pulling it up, and the audience should be able to see it if they're watching on YouTube. where this is a quote from Dr. James Leo Garrett, who is, pastor. He's now the distinguished professor of theology emeritus at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he was for years the dean of the School of Theology, I believe, and kind of the lead theologian there at Southwestern, the largest Southern Baptist seminary in the world.
I think his work, his systematic theology, last I checked, I think it's out of print. Somebody needs to get on that.
Yeah, that's the one. I have on my shelf. It's a great systematic from a traditionalist, and
they're going for about $400.
Yeah, that's why I'm holding on to mine like gold, because you can't get them in print anymore. But he says this. He said, from Augustine of Hippo to the 20th century, Western Christianity has tended to interpret the doctrine of election from the perspective of and with regard to individual human beings. During those same centuries, the doctrine has been far less emphasized and seldom ever controversial in Eastern Orthodoxy. Is it possible that Augustine, and later Calvin, with the help of many others, contributed to a hyper-individualization of this doctrine that was hardly warranted? And I think he's making the same point that I want you to kind of unpack for us, that there is a sense in which we've hyper-individualized much of the intention possibly of the original authors. Well,
it's not a mere possibility. It's just the way it is. He's right. It's not. I wouldn't say it's possible. They have. That's what. But I don't know. If you go back to the 4th and 5th century, I'm not sure. I'm not an Augustinian scholar. I've read Augustine, but there are bits of me that do wonder, from what Augustine I have read, given that maybe he's not being, he's more individualized in his thinking, I think mainly because of his deterministic leanings later in life. But still, I don't know that if all the reconstructions of Augustine's theology have benefited from the same type of models that are used now with, socio-cultural insights from the ancient Mediterranean world to reconstruct biblical texts. So, as far as the standard line that from Augustine forward, trace that line, Augustine, Aquinas to Luther to Calvin, that in the West, individualism did progress greater and greater, especially, around the time of the Reformation. In his book From Dawn to Decadence by Jacques Barzun, he traces the prominence of this kind of individualistic culture in the West, and its and that way of thinking in the West, the more introspective way, the more understanding of the individual self as a whole unit, like a personal embodied universe, distinct from all other members of your family and your community and whatever. He traces the influence of that, on through the Reformation. So I'm not sure, and the impact that individualism has had in the West in general. So I'm not really sure how much more of an individualized setting 4th and 5th century Northern and Southern African parts of that world were too far removed. So I would be interested in seeing some sociologically inclined rereadings of Augustine, more sensitive to the same types of things that we do for the first century documents, and then the Old Testament and things like that. Because I don't know enough about Augustinian scholarship, but I wonder if a fresh rereading of that, using the same type of interdisciplinary approach to Scripture, was used in subsequent writings of the Church, and
right.
And it could be the same. Later Western theologians through the medieval period and on to the Reformation period might have been misreading bits of that as well. So I don't know enough about it, but I would be interested to see that.
Yeah, well, it's a definite,
the results of that kind of study.
It's definitely an interesting study, because because like you said, this is not just like an opinion that traditionalists are come up with, like, hey, let's find ways to discredit Calvinism, so we'll come up with this hyper individualization argument or something of that nature. I've actually heard reformers, when talking about other things besides soteriology, talk about this issue that we tend to, as Westerners, think it's about me, I, my. It's about the individual, when oftentimes the correct interpretation is more of a corporate perspective, or that he's speaking more corporately or broadly.
No question in the biblical world, when we're talking about the Old and New Testaments, if we're talking about at least through the 2nd century, no doubt we're talking about concepts of collectivist cultures. We're talking about honor, shame being the pivotal values of the culture. No question we're talking about concepts like corporate solidarity, the one and the many, figurehead representation, what we call corporate heads and corporate bodies. No question. What I've always found interesting in theologians' works, the works like systematic theology, is sometimes they'll make a distinction. Well, election in the Old Testament was corporate, but it's individual in the New Testament. And I'm like, where in the world do you get that? Sometimes they just artificially create that distinction.
Well, the way I've heard it said is that it's the apostolic interpretation of the Old Testament. The way James White put it when we were debating, when I would point back to him.
That's not the apostolic interpretation. That is James White's ideas about the apostolic interpretation.
What's his interpretation of the apostles' interpretation of the Old Testament?
Right.
But ultimately, what he has to be saying then is he's ultimately saying that Paul has to eisegete the Old Testament in order to support his newfound soteriological view of election.
Right. That was one of my biggest complaints about his performance in the debate. And then I think in the Potter's Promise and other things where he's talked about Romans 9, he just kind of goes off the rails with his ideas of Paul's use of the Old Testament being some sort of atomistic approach, where Paul just, well, if this sentence worked fine for what point he wants to make, he'll just rip it out of Malachi and stick it in there because it sounds good or something, as if he's not taking in the larger context,
right?
In his understanding of Paul's use of. But I don't even know of any Reformed biblical scholars who would affirm that sort of atomistic approach nowadays. Maybe older scholarship would, but I mean, guys like Darrell Bach or G.K. Beale or some of those guys wouldn't say that Paul was an atomistic guy with his use of the Old Testament, without considering the broader concepts and themes. So his supposed ideas about apostolic interpretations, those are his interpretations, like you said, of the apostolic interpretations. Those aren't the apostolic ones. Paul's use of the Old Testament is a pretty interesting subject. It's a broad subject. There's a lot of material to read on that. Richard B. Hayes has done some really good work in that. That's worth reading. Echoes of Scripture and the Letters of Paul being one of his more prominent works. I think he's written a subsequent volume as well, Conversion of the Imagination or something. I can't remember the title. But those books pretty much, slammed the door shut on any sort of idea of reading Paul as if he is just ripping the Old Testament out of its context and shoving it in there to make a point about God picking Jacob to be saved and Esau to be damned. What in the world?
Well, yeah, and also, and doing so before they were ever born or did anything good or bad. That's, it's ultimately you have the implication of that interpretation is that God hates, salvifically speaking, unborn babies, at least most of them, which is just
that's so far removed from what Paul's going on about in Romans 9 anyway that it's not. It's not even worth taking it seriously anymore. But I understand just because. Some people are used to certain presuppositions in their hermeneutics, and in American theology, American evangelical theology in particular, it's the idea that you find the how one gets to heaven scheme in every passage of Scripture. Actually, not even close to what's going on in most of these texts.
Yeah.
So But as far as collectivism goes, I mean, there's no question. And what folds into that, when we say collectivism, it's where the interests of the group are primary to the interests of any individual. So they see themselves, what we call dyadic personality, is that one's self-understanding is, in an honor-shame culture, more collectivist culture, is what your estimation of me is, and what our family and our tribe and our nation, whatever my public reputation, whatever my public estimation, my value to the group is how an individual person would understand themselves.
Right.
Right. And so people, Bruce Molina talks about this in his the New Testament World Book. It's a standard textbook in this kind of field. And he talks about that people didn't get to know one another. Even close kin didn't get to know one another in the same way that you and I might sit around and talk about our deepest feelings and our thoughts on how we view things or whatever, like that. And in honor shame cultures, it wasn't some sort of guilt type thing that they feel if they did something wrong that they knew was wrong. It was more of, if this was discovered, I would bring shame upon not just myself, but on my family, my kin, my tribe, Right. If I behaved in certain ways that were frowned upon, it looked as shameful for my in-group, whatever the in-group is. And so it's less, I feel guilty for something bad that I did. It's, if you got caught, my honor rating is going to plummet, and that's going to affect everyone around me. Nowadays we don't want to say that, well, if your brother ends up in jail, that reflects poorly on you and all your cousins, but that's not the way it was in the ancient world,
Right.
And so there was a lot of reinforcement that if your self-worth is how am I perceived by our group, am I an honorable contributor to our group, is how people understood themselves, that they weren't introspective in the way that we are. They had an outward-oriented social consciousness more so than a personal, internalized conscious, and
Right.
and their thought world was more outward than inward.
Well, it seems to me that. Well, I'm getting feedback back from you. Maybe you need to put on headphones. Just 1 second. Okay, we had a little technical difficulty there, but back on. Well, I wanted to play this little clip, Johnathan, from NT Wright, because he's actually in this clip confronting John Piper, because John Piper. Well, you can hear what he says here. He's also making NT Wright, obviously, if you don't know who NT Wright is, he's probably one of the most known leading New Testament scholars. And he and John Piper have kind of gone back and forth on their different views of justification and other things, which maybe we can discuss at some other time. But he's addressing this issue of understanding Jews within their actual culture. In other words, learning enough about the Jewish culture and the way they would have read a text versus the way a Westerner 2,000 years later would have read the text. And listen to how he confronts John Piper in his critique of N.T. Wright's teachings on this subject. Let's listen in.
An awful lot of this comes down to really understanding how a first century Jewish mind worked. Now, of course, you quickly say there are lots of different first century Judaisms around the place. Different first century Jews have different ways of looking at things. But there are many things which are massively in common. One of the reasons I wrote the New Testament of the People of God in the early 90s was that I was fed up having to spend hour after hour with individual pupils explaining basic things about first century Judaism when the tutorial was supposed to be on, say, the parables in Mark or Paul and the law or something, but discovering that you just couldn't get to that if they didn't understand the basics about how a Jewish worldview would have worked. And it's very interesting. Somebody asked about John Piper this morning. Piper, in his book, Written Against Me, actually warns his readers against taking first century Judaism too seriously, which I find just astonishing. Be very wary of that stuff. It may lead you astray. Just stick with the Bible and you'll be all right. So, okay, stick with the Bible, you'll be all right. But unless you understand the world in which the New Testament was written, you will just commit massive anachronisms all down the line.
And that sounds a lot like what you have been talking about as well when we have our discussions over this topic.
Yeah, anachronisms is a nicer way of saying treating the Bible like a commode and dumping all your ideas into it. But that's essentially what he's kind of going on to the same thing. I think it's ridiculous that you would say, don't study first century Judaism. I mean, right now, one of the courses we teach on primary sources is we look at ancient Akkadian, Sumerian, Egyptian literature, doing comparative analysis with the Old Testament text. We look at Second Temple Judaism texts. We look at the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, all of that stuff. We look at Greco-Roman texts. I'm still waiting for my friend Dr. John Mark Reynolds to write the book Echoes of Plato in the Letters of Paul to kind of go along with Richard Hayes' books of the Old Testament. But, we look at all of those kind of texts and do comparative literary analysis because you want to pay attention to not just the similarities, but the distinctive differences of each of those. So I wouldn't imagine being able to understand the world from which the Bible came without understanding that world in order to get a fuller understanding of the biblical texts.
Right. Well, I mean, when you begin to think about how much has changed from the first century Jewish world and how they understood just common language and how we have interaction with each other. I mean, you think about even in our own day, I mean, 300-400 years ago where I'm sitting right now would have been probably Apache Indians. And that's just 300 or 400 years. That's not really all that long when you really begin to think about it. I think it was my great-great-grandmother on both sides of my family were both Cherokee Indians. It's not really that long ago that this land that I'm sitting in here in Texas was, pure Indian territory. And that's 300-400 years. That's how much difference, that's how much time lapse was from the writings of the New Testament. And when St. Augustine came along from Africa and his culture, and he didn't know Greek, and he began to interpret and bring some teachings, which some of the things I think he wrote were pretty good, but others, as we well know, weren't very Greek-minded, or at least from the perspective of what a Greek culture would have thought of and how they would have thought within their culture and the way they interpret and understand things.
Well, yeah, 400 years is a long time, but people didn't really like change in the ancient world. We like progress and change and things to be different. That was not something valued in the ancient world. I'm always curious of. I mean, sure, his linguistic skills probably weren't that great, but I just have to wonder if there's misreadings of Augustine as well. Kind of from see, the idea of collectivism is, well, what's the role of the individual? What's
right?
How does an individual fit into that? Can you pause?
Sure. One second. Okay. Dr. Pritchett had a phone call, so we're back now. Tell me, if you're a student from Trinity comes to you and there's asking the question, okay, just boil this down for me. If I'm reading Ephesians 1, for example, or some other controversial text, which typically this collectivist view is brought into, or at least it needs to be understood in order to understand it within its right context, how would you instruct them? What kind of bottom line, what do you need to know about how the Jew, or any first century person for that matter, would have read the text from that perspective versus the way many Westerners read it today?
Well, of course, if they're students of Trinity, I wouldn't boil it down for them, make them do all the work. But for your audience, it's the when you read a text like Romans 9, or you read a text like Ephesians 1, these contested texts. Okay, some people are going to try to find their identity in people who are mentioned, right? because what they do, and especially for first century Jews, would find their sense of identity in the patriarchs. John the Baptist's critique, don't think that you have any sort of standing as a son of Abraham. God can raise up sons of Abraham from rocks,
Right.
But their sense of identity is rooted in these patriarchs, is rooted in the covenant made at Sinai, is rooted in their identity with Moses.
Right.
And so when you're going through a text that's recounting Israel's history, like Romans 9, or God's purposes in creation to have a people to be summed up in Christ, they would think texts like Deuteronomy, they would think New Exodus, things like that. Right. They would understand where is our identity. And if you look at Ephesians 1, you see in him, in him, in him, in him,
right,
is the constant refrain. And the we, the you, the plural you, the us, that kind of those pronouns that are interweaved through, and it's creating a sense. I mean, collectivism, corporate solidarity, the one of the many, your sense of identity, how are you esteemed by others, how you are relating to the corporate people, the estimation of your worth as I'm one of them, and they value me and I value them, and that's how you have a sense of self-worth and understanding. They're trying to find their identity rooted in something, and it's going to be rooted in the corporate head on the one hand and the corporate body on the other. So a collectivist mindset with this idea of, viewing the self as dyadic personality doesn't exclude individuals by any means. It's how that they understand themselves, and how when they hear, in the original, obviously, they'd be hearing these texts, and Paul's doxology in Ephesians 1, that really long, lofty sentence where he just kind of, it's the biggest run-on sentence that Paul wrote. They're getting this new community, this new family. So we would call it kind of between the Jew and Gentiles together. You would call it a fictive kinship, is kind of the sociological term for it. It's trying to bring them together to give them a sense of shared identity within the corporate body. Right. Whereas if you think about chose us in him before the foundation of the world, what we know about Christ is Christ, 1 Peter 1:21, foreknown before the foundation of the world, doesn't say that at the beginning of 1 Peter about the elect according to the foreknowledge, because Jesus was foreknown. Jesus is explicitly called the chosen one by God. Right. Just to see the collectivist mindset in Romans 9, where he's talking about the twins, even. Right. And the same passage that Paul's quoting from, you see, God himself says 2 nations are in your womb. Mm-hmm. Right. You see that identity is tied up with these patriarchs as kind of corporate figureheads. And so when I hear people say, well, it's not really about nations, it's about individuals, I'm saying, well, the way God esteemed even the twins in this passage, God himself reckoned the 2 individuals as nations first. Right. So you can believe God, or you can believe Western individualists who say Paul's not talking about what God's talking about. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to go with God here, because you can either believe God, that he reckons the twins as nations, or you can believe people who say, nuh-uh, but you can't really do both. Right. Now, it doesn't exclude them as individuals, but it's understanding this sense of corporate solidarity. It's understanding the sense of corporate identity in a collectivist culture, and this is how that they would view that. Right. So individuals do matter into that, especially if they're these corporate heads. But for an audience listening to this, they're trying to find the location of their new identity, because if you're a Jew or a Gentile, either way, if you become a Christian, you have defected from a national religion of the Jews or the national religion of the pagans. Right. Right? You're a defector. So you have found, for whatever reason, the benefits of conversion being worth it to you to defect from your people group, which is going to bring shame upon them, and they're going to heap a large amount of shame on you for having defected. So when you're trying to build up Christian communities that are basically made up of defectors, you're going to use this kind of language to help them, give them a new sense of identity, because they've left their old sense of identity.
Right.
We tend to cast conversion in the modern world, in the modern evangelical world, as something that doesn't factor into this. I mean, there's some analogs to it, but I mean, you can disappoint your parents if you're a Muslim and you convert to Christianity. We can understand things like that. You can disappoint your atheist parents if their kids end up becoming Christian or something.
Right.
But I mean, compound that to where it doesn't just affect your parents, but it affects larger communities, even what an individual does within that larger group identity. Your understanding of yourself is rooted in what those closest to you esteem you as.
Right.
So the language of the New Testament as a whole is about giving the members of this community, all of which are defectors from one religion or another, a sense of identity, a new fictive kinship, a new family in the people of God. You are God's people. And because this people exists, so you go to Romans 9 and you find Gentiles are included in the people of God. How can this be? And Paul traces a historical account
Right.
of Israel's history, and the sense of the vocation that they're going to be the line of people from whom comes the Messiah according to the flesh, who is also God over all, forever blessed. Amen. That's what that's all going on about. So, it's just, to me, like you said, this kind of stuff led you out of Calvinism. It's what led me out of Calvinism. Just understanding the ancient Mediterranean world and studying the backgrounds of the Bibles helped me see the text in new light. And I just discovered that I could no longer affirm Calvinistic readings of passages because it just didn't make sense. And I discovered, well, hey, I guess I'm not a Calvinist anymore because I don't agree with any of that exegesis anymore. And this kind of stuff led me out of it as well, because we're misreading the text. And we can there's so much more to talk about. You can talk more about honor, shame. You can talk more about kinship. You can talk more about grace and patron-client reciprocity and all types of dynamics in the ancient world that come into play in these texts. Those are being the four biggest building blocks of the ancient Mediterranean world, reconstructing it. So,
well, and the only thing I would add to what you're already saying is to say that so oftentimes that there's this misconception, I think, that because we're talking about a corporate view of election or a corporate approach to this interpretation, that somehow we're dismissing or not acknowledging that individuals are also in focus. And I think you rightly pointed out that, Jacob is an individual. He was an individual in the womb of Rebecca. I mean, he is an individual. Pharaoh is an individual. We're not trying to say individuals aren't in focus. We're simply also including the fact that those are also national heads that are representing nations as a whole, and therefore the purpose for bringing those people up might be different than the individualized who's going to be effectually saved and who's not.
Typological.
Right.
It's typological. And you're talking about types going back to Romans 5. Even Thomas Schreiner and Doug Moo will acknowledge that that's also what's going on in passages like Romans 9. But then they just try to quickly sweep all that under the rug and get you back to thinking about their theological views. But really, if you give it its full weight, it's not about excluding individuals and focusing on the corporate. It's about what's primary. And I know that Brian Abbassiano has gone to great lengths trying to communicate these ideas to people. And I know Zebra Crook in his Reconceptualizing Conversion says it's not helpful that because you see an individual, you all would think, well, the corporate dynamic part is secondary and the individualist thing is primary, because that's just reading your own Western individualist ideas back onto ancient documents,
right,
and supposing because there's an individual mentioned there, that's the primary thing. And no, it's not. You've got to. I could never think like a collectivist until I became embedded in a collectivist culture for years, right? Because I'm a introspective, unified whole. I'm an island individualist. My own sense of self-identity is internalized rather than external. It's a whole different way of thinking. The fact that I can try to do my best to understand that doesn't mean that I could ever become that, because I'm conditioned to be the way that I am. You're conditioned to be a modern individualist Westerner. You would have to be embedded for years to think like that. But when you can at least grasp the concepts, you can see where you're going wrong,
right,
when you're understanding text from antiquity.
Yeah, and it is a it's like the lenses we've talked about. You put on certain lenses. Culture gives you a lens through which you would read and understand any text. That's just facts. That's just facts of the matter. Anybody who's a linguist or who knows multiple languages recognizes this. They understand that if you're in Spain and you've lived in Spain all your life and you spoke Spanish all your life, that the way a Spanish person takes a particular phrase versus the way it's taken in a Western, or in the United States in English, they understand there's different idioms, there's different ways in which you understand something, there's different ways in which a culture that's very tribal and communal and has all the families for 4 generations living in one apartment building and one house in one place. They see things in a very different way than our little apartment life, where everybody is kind of in their own little world dynamic that's just totally and completely different in how you view and understand things. And again, that's not an excuse to say that, okay, our interpretation must be right, yours must be wrong. It's simply a fact of the matter that this is what the Jewish culture and the culture in general, like you've pointed out, in the first century, this is the way they are. And it's also the way most other cultures, besides the American culture, most other
cultures, they're honor shame cultures, they're more collectivist cultures. Your sense of identity is more external than it is internal, what you want to make of yourself. Whereas you're trying to say, how can I be a valuable member to my family, my kinship, my community, and so forth. So this is not radical. John Piper's approach is madness. It's one thing to just learn the Greek, and if you have the time, learn the Greek, but it doesn't stop there. And I wouldn't even say that that's like even the main thing, because you can take John Piper. He has pretty good Greek skills. The same bad ideas back into the Greek text as you can the English text. You've got to look at the history, you've got to look at the archaeology, you've got to look at the social dynamics, the economics of the ancient world, the religious practices, the customs, the social values of these various communities. And it's not always going to be monolithic. You have to do that background material. And that's why we emphasize that at Trinity College of Bible and Theological Seminary, because what we want people to do is we want to see people to see the texts as the original audience understood it, so that we make proper theological constructs from the text, and that we give proper interpretation and application for our modern world. And the more you know about the ancient world, the more you'll see the text as it was originally written and originally received.
Well, and this is one of the ways I was introduced to you, Johnathan, back in the day. It was after my debate with Dr. White. And you guys did a podcast. I didn't know y'all from Adam. Obviously, it was just somebody sent me a link to a podcast from these guys from Trinity, and you were talking. You and Dr. Hunter were talking about the debate. And y'all remember y'all pronouncing my name different every time, like Leighton, and I think you were getting it wrong and right, and sometimes anyway. It's just funny. But I remember listening to you guys kind of critique the debate, and it was interesting because there were so many Calvinistic podcasts out there critiquing me, but having someone from a traditional perspective or from a non-Calvinistic perspective critiquing it was interesting to hear from y'all's perspective. And one of the things you pointed out that is a lot of what you just now said, where when we understand that hermeneutics, because he kept saying Leighton didn't do exegesis, and you kept pointing out, now wait, guys, before you're doing line-by-line exegesis, before you go to the Greek of this verb and this, how it declensioned of this, you've got to go for the bird's eye view, and you've got to understand the background material. That's how you do proper hermeneutics. Before you get to the line-by-line exegesis, you do the hermeneutic of the text. What is happening in this day? And talking about the judicial hardening of Israel, talking about the collectivist nature of the way Paul would have been speaking. All of that speaks to the hermeneutic. Exactly. And so you
provide a context for your interpretation, because I declared you the winner of that debate. I said rhetorically they were about evenly matched, but of course you get past the rhetoric, and you were the only one who actually met the burden of the debate question, so won just on that basis alone. But I also pointed out that in y'all's debate, James White didn't do any exegesis. He read a line of Romans 9 and told us what it meant to him. And that's great if you're sitting on the couch at an emergent church somewhere, just telling people what the text means to you in your heart of hearts. But when you want to talk about what the text means in reality, you have to do all the legwork.
Right.
Which what you did in the brief amount of time that you had. And so I thought that was great. I know that other people's mileage and criticism of the debate may vary, but I think somewhere on your Soteria 101 thing, I wish I would have copied and pasted it, but I listed like 9 things that maybe I said them in the in that podcast you referenced. Maybe if you remember where that is, which I don't, put a link to it. But yeah, I mean, I listed out like 9 things that James White just completely bungled in that debate on Romans 9. 9 problems. I know one of them had to do with the use of the Old Testament, Paul's use of the Old Testament. It was just made me want to tear my hair out. But it had a lot to do with this. But yeah, if you don't do this legwork, you're going to miss so much. But when you do this legwork and learn this background material about what was it like in the ancient world, I mean, so much of the text jumps out at you that you don't want to read through it. Like I used to read through certain passages just to move along to the passages I knew were coming up they were the meat of the thing.
Right, yeah. Get to my favorite parts, yeah.
Right, but there's just so much packed into these once you start thinking in new ways about how to approach text. And of course, if you get into what I like to get into with the rhetorical criticism and look at just the way that they're framing the arguments to try to persuade the audience and stuff, and their speeches and the narratives and the epistles, it's just it's exciting.
Yeah.
It's certainly more interesting than Calvinism, but I mean, they're gonna have their views and all this. And what's interesting to me though is these scholars are sharp. I read Carson, I read Thomas Schreiner, and some of these more Baptist-like Reformed guys. And what's sad, especially with the NT Wright thing that we quoted, where he was talking about justification, and then they wrote 2 volumes of variegated nomism, trying to. Like, it was almost as if, oh, brother, we got to go read all these Second Temple texts, to see if we can't find a way to respond to Saunders. And when you look at it, it's like you get this impression, what I know, or at least I hope you know. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you're not off in the deep end of the pool like I am, but you at least have been in the shallow end of all of this background stuff, and they just completely dismiss it. They dot their hats to it, and then they just get back to their own theological agendas and their exegesis. And I'm like, how is it that you're not, doing what I know you should be doing in your commentaries? How are you,
do you think
why are you not bringing?
Do you think some of it, Pritchett, do you think some of it is that if you adopted that particular worldview, or maybe you even was raised in it, almost like they even accuse the traditionalist, the non-Calvinist, they accuse us of not being willing to accept their worldview because of our tradition, all those kinds of things. And obviously, whoever's wrong is obviously, following a man-made tradition, not the Word of God. So we could both make that claim to the other, and that's not what I'm not just trying to beg the question here. What I'm trying to say is, could it be that Calvinists who are more learned like that, who do obviously understand collectivism, and they even recognize it whenever they're talking about other doctrines and other issues, or they're bringing up all of the deep end issues that you're even talking about, and that either there's a cognitive dissonance or such a high commitment to that theological worldview that either their blinders go up or they just automatically just dismiss anything that could possibly suggest that maybe they're wrong about their interpretation Calvinistically of those texts?
4 things. 2 of those, yes. I'll add to it. 1, I think some of those scholars are actually lazy. They don't want to be bothered with all that comparative literature analysis. They don't want to be bothered with all that sociological stuff. So I'll add that to the 2 things you just mentioned: the blinders and what was the other thing you mentioned?
Well, being committed to your tradition. Yeah, your high commitment. I mean, you've made your living on this particular doctrinal view. You can't really abandon it.
And then the 4th thing I'll add is that a lot of these people are employed at places that they have to sign confessional statements that, if anything in their published work ends up being contrary, to their confessional statements, their job's in jeopardy.
Yeah.
Right. And we've seen that in people who've taken Old Testament background studies seriously. You see Westminster Theological Seminary like vacating their Old Testament scholars, professors, saying you're all fired, over this stuff. I mean, so people who don't want to follow the evidence that are in line with the academic freedom becomes limited. I believe that you should be able to have your own doctrinal standards and your doctrinal statements, and that you should. But I also believe that it should be a charitable one. But I think in a lot of ways these scholars just they don't want to publish. It's why, I mean, I know this is off topic, but I always tell traditionalists that Salvation and Sovereignty by Ken Keathley is not a friendly book towards your views. It is written, in my view, like someone who has to affirm the AP, trying to not be Calvinist enough to please non-Calvinists, while at the same time being Calvinist enough to keep his job at Southeastern, because he has to affirm the A and P, and he comes up with weird a Molinism that neither Bruce Swear on the Calvinistic end of the spectrum of Molinism or William Lane Craig on the Arminian spectrum end of Molinism would recognize.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
because
he's only way
as if he's trying to stay within a certain.
The only thing I would push you back on is he does affirm libertarian freedom, and so what I would push you back on that is that I'll use your own words against you on that argument, Pritchett, is that one of the things that you're known for saying to me is at least non-Calvinists are finally having discussions among ourselves versus going back to the same old conversations over and over again about the tulip. And that's one thing I think that, conversations with Keathley and others, differences within, quote unquote, our camp, within a traditionalist camp or within a libertarian affirmation of libertarian freedom.
Well, I welcome it to the discussion. I'm just telling you what it reads like to me, and I'm not the only one, because if you look at the Journal of Baptist Theology and Ministry back in 2011 and 2012 at some of Eric Hankin's contributions, dig in the footnotes, and he takes Keathley to task as well, because some of his views of election and all that are not compatible with, I think the bulk of traditionalism is a corporate election view.
Right. Well, and that leads right into what we probably need to close with, because I promised I would try to keep this one shorter. And that leads right into the fact that we are having a Great Commission summit here in Texas on August 11th and 12th at Dallas Baptist University. You are all welcome to attend. Kenneth Keathley will be there, along with Dr. David Allen and Eric Hankins, you just mentioned. Dr. Rick Patrick will be there.
Go at it over election. That'd be great.
Well, they're going to do a question answer time towards the end of the discussion, so maybe they can talk about it.
Yeah. If you're there, you gotta pit them again. I'm not saying this is anything personal against Ken Keathley. I'm just saying his book is an example of somebody who's writing within the constraints of a doctrinal statement that's tied to their employment. And it reads like that.
In your opinion, it is. You don't know for sure. He might really believe that. In other words, he may not be trying. I mean, in other words, you may seem like to you that he's trying to stay within the confines of his employment, but maybe really he does believe exactly how he versed.
Well, he wouldn't have signed the statement if he didn't believe it, right? But I'm just saying, I don't think a lot of things follow from his soteriology,
right?
If you're a 3-point Calvinist, which is what the A and P is. It's total depravity, perseverance of the saints, and unconditional election. Right. Of course, unconditional election in that scheme is going to be an individual election, so I don't think it's really biblically faithful. And I think the ambulatory model of grace is so far removed from patron-client reciprocity that it's not even worth talking about. But anyway, that's a whole different thing. But yeah, I mean, I like the guy. Nothing wrong with it. I'm just saying, why do I think that sometimes scholars do that? I was using that as an example back to what you were saying, why these people do that. Well, even moderate Calvinists, they know what, Keathley, I don't know if he knows about, I don't think he sits around and reads Aristotle and applies Isocrates' dispositio models to
right
New Testament. I don't think he gets into all that. But, I mean, some of these guys, I just think that, it depends. I mean, not everyone has the same interest. We're all working on the same things. But it's amazing how you get self-identified Calvinists like Michael Bird or NT Wright across the pond versus the American Calvinist tradition, where these guys do take on board all that background stuff. And if you read their scholarship, you're like, people just can't believe that they're even Calvinists.
Yeah.
But they both, Bird and Wright, have both identified themselves as Calvinistic anyway. But you'd never really think that was obvious reading their work.
Well, and I think that's some of what in America, how Calvinism has been kind of limited to this tulip concept, whereas Calvinism in other places is a more broad term, much more broad term.
Because American evangelicals don't care for their work. I mean, they'll say the obligatory. I appreciate their contribution to the resurrection for NT Wright, and I appreciate defending Christology and the synoptics for Michael. But then after they say the nice things, they'll start ripping them to pieces.
Which is pretty common among those you disagree with in theological circles. But.
That's why I don't try to butter up before I punch you in the face. Let me just punch you in the face and be friends afterwards. I mean, this obligatory puff up before you smack somebody. Just smack them. Just say what you want, take your shot, and then be nice afterwards. That's my theory.
Well, Dr. Pritchett, thank you again for joining us at Soteriology 101, and we'll have you back again. We'll talk some more theology. I really appreciate your time today.
Yes, I do want to recommend the book to your readers.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
If you want a good primer on all of this stuff, a really good book that I like that's real readable is Misreading Scripture in Westernized, or if you want something a little bit more academic, David De Silva's Honor, Patronage, Kinship, and Purity. Those books will get you going in a good understanding of the Old Testament and New Testament world.
Awesome.
And the social dynamics of the biblical world, especially for the New Testament. Those books will get you going right away with some good information from more conservative end of the evangelical spectrum.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, Dr. Pritchett. We'll talk to you next time.
All right. God bless.
All right. Bye-bye.